May I proceed?
Yes.
Okay, you've described the patrol. You started to describe the patrol around the house, and I think you said the person who's assigned to the house would be in that security office at the end of the video library building, garage building, and would also walk around the house?
Yes.
Does that mean walk inside the house?
No.
Did security walk inside the house from time to time?
Yes.
Was that part of the regular patrol, to walk inside the house?
No.
When you say, walk around the house, then you literally mean around the outside of the house.
Yes.
And what was the purpose of doing that?
To make sure we didn't have any hazards or uninvited guests or trespassers.
Was it important to make sure that the house, in general, was secure?
Yes.
Now, during the time that you've been there, have there been trespassers located on the ranch?
Yes.
And how close to the house did they get?
We've had one trespasser who did enter the house.
And where was that person ultimately found?
In the very top floor of the main house, in the train room.
So right up above where the children's rooms are, Prince and Paris's rooms are?
Yes.
So that was a very private part of the house?
Yes.
And without going into a lot of detail, who was this person? Was this a fan or?
We determined she was not from this country. She was a fan. We couldn't communicate with her very well, because she didn't speak English, so she was arrested.
You speak Spanish yourself?
Yes.
So she didn't speak English or Spanish, I take it.
I believe she spoke German, which I do not speak.
So sort of not a normal person to sneak into somebody's house, though?
No.
And do you know how long that person was there before she was located?
I'd estimate she was there approximately 10 hours.
Have there ever been any people located on the ranch who had weapons?
We recently did arrest someone who had a weapon. It was not loaded with anything. It was a disabled weapon.
A handgun?
Handgun, yes. 9mm.
Now, in your years of working in security, have you ever performed security functions for Mr. Jackson off of the ranch?
Yes.
And where would that be?
I've taken them to the Lompoc fireworks show. I think I've maybe done that 2 or 3 times.
Okay, have you ever been gone on tour or gone to other cities with them?
No.
Does he have security staff who he employs for that purpose?
Yes.
And that security staff is not under your jurisdiction, is that correct?
No.
Excuse me. Alright, so when this foot patrol, I'm saying, foot patrol, but the person around the house, you say foot patrol person around the house, what are some of the things that they check? You said there was some woman that got into the upper house. I assume that's something you try to prevent.
Yes. We check the doors. The house is secured at all times. Now the house is secured at all times. So we make sure that the doors and windows are closed. We also make sure that, if there's anything like a fire happening or some other hazard that's going on.
And that sort of thing has happened in the past, has it not?
As far as fires?
Fires.
Yes.
So you check the door, like the back door and the front door, correct?
We check all the doors.
Are there some doors around Mr. Jackson's private quarters?
Yes.
What doors are there?
There's a patio door entrance.
Alright, so there's a patio right behind Mr. Jackson's private suite, correct?
Yes.
And there's a door that locks in the wall around that private patio, is that right?
Yes.
And why is it important to keep that secured?
To make sure, we do open it occasionally for people to go in and clean. If we do find it unsecured, then we go as far as his back door and make sure that it's still secure, and we clear the area, and then close it afterwards, lock it.
If an intruder were to get in and they knew where they were going, and they were able to get through that door, that would be a pretty significant breach of security as far as Mr. Jackson's personal area is concerned. Is that correct?
Yes.
Alright, now, when we talk about the personal area, are you aware that there are locks on Mr. Jackson's door into his personal bedroom suite?
Yes.
Alright, there are guests who have. Let me withdraw that. If guests stay at the guest quarters that are just across the front driveway, is that right? By the lake, correct?
Yes.
If guests stay there, where do they take their meals?
In the main house.
So they would be expected to have the code to come into the main house, sit down at the breakfast table or the breakfast bar there.
Yes.
Or the dining table, I suppose, for dinner, right?
Yes.
Is that fairly routine? In other words, most of the guests that are staying overnight there have access to the main house?
Yes.
Do most of the guests who are staying overnight there have access to Mr. Jackson's private quarters?
I wouldn't say most guests.
So Mr. Jackson will decide who he's going to allow into his private quarters, is that right?
Yes.
And on a given day, you might have staff people and visitors and a number of other people in that main part of the house, is that right?
Yes.
Does Mr. Jackson want to maintain some privacy from that general group of people that might be there at any given time?
Yes.
Now, there's also an arcade. I'm sorry, no, that's right, an arcade building.
Yes.
We talked about the video library, but there's a separate building that's the arcade building, correct?
Yes.
Alright, and is that usually locked?
It's locked at a certain hour, I would say about 2 a.m. when guests are on property, unless it's been requested to leave it open all night. Otherwise, it's open approximately about 8 a.m. in the morning.
Alright, and a part of that building are a couple of bathrooms, a men's room and a ladies' room, is that correct?
Yes.
And where is that in relation to the swimming pool?
If you were facing the swimming pool, it would be to the left.
There's also a tennis court nearby there, is that correct?
Yes, it's further left of that.
So if people are using the tennis court or the swimming pool, is that where they'd be likely to go if they were going to use the restrooms?
Yes.
And are those restrooms, that restroom area, is that left unlocked during the time people are using the pool?
Yes.
Alright, now, that leaves the supervisor, I think. What does the supervisor do?
The supervisor is there to supervise the officers. Make sure that we have daily duties that we do, such as checking our inventory or equipment, making sure that the basic part of our duties are being met. We have something that's a little more elevated than regular routine business there to manage that problem.
I take it the supervisor also will keep an eye out for security issues throughout the ranch, is that right?
Yes.
By the way, are any of the security guards armed?
No.
Not with anything?
We do have pepper spray. But that's used only under very limited conditions. We've never pepper sprayed anyone.
That's pretty limited, so you've never used it?
Never used it.
And it's there for the case of an intruder, for the most part. Would that be correct?
Yes.
So you don't carry firearms, stun guns, anything like that?
Not during the time when I was chief.
Alright, you mentioned the gate logs. And you're aware that there was a search on November 18, 2003, is that correct?
Yes.
Were you at the ranch when the search occurred?
Not initially, but I did arrive afterwards.
Was it your shift to be there?
I was not going to start my shift until noon that day.
So somebody called you, and you came more quickly?
Routinely I would call in the morning to see what activities happened overnight, if there was anything I needed to be briefed on. So I'd usually call around 8 a.m. to see what was new or what would be expected for that day. I was actually on the phone with Brian Sales, who's a firefighter, just going over regular things when he was describing to me what happened.
Alright, so what happened? You were hearing that a whole lot of sheriff's deputies and other people all of a sudden arrived at the ranch. Is that correct?
Yes.
So you came in?
Yes.
At the time of the search, was there any effort made to conceal anything from law enforcement?
No.
Object. Leading.
Sustained.
Alright, to your knowledge, were there any efforts made one way or another to prevent law enforcement from finding something?
No.
Same objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Alright, in any event, after the officers left, did you stay there till they left?
Yes.
About what time of night did they leave?
Approximately 11, between 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m.
Alright, excuse me 1 second, I'll just ask. Can I have the gate logs? I don't remember the number. It's the book with the gate logs.
Mr. Auchincloss has them.
There's a good reason why you can't find it. Alright, thank you. Alright, we're talking about a gate, or I'm going to talk about gate logs here in a second. So you told us about the gate logs being kept at the ranch, right?
Yes.
When are the entries made in the gate logs?
The entries are made as people arrive. Their in time is documented or logged on the sheet when they leave.
So in other words, they're logs that are made contemporaneously with the event. Something happens, and it's written down, is that right?
Yes.
It's not written down at the end of shift or the next day, for the most part.
No.
Okay. When the officers searched, the team from the sheriff's department and the district attorney's office searched and they left. Did you, at some point thereafter, did you have occasion to determine whether or not they had located all of the gate logs?
I believe they had complete access. They did have complete access to it. We had 2 investigators and 1 deputy in that security office for approximately 2 hours.
Did they take the gate logs for 2003?
No.
Where were they located?
They were located in the file cabinet.
Right there in the security office?
Yes.
Alright, did you later at some point locate those records?
I located them that same evening.
Later, in the middle of the night?
I was there for another day.
Alright, so you didn't go home that night?
No.
What did you do with the gate logs?
I left them in the file cabinet.
At some point, did you take those gate logs out and give them to somebody?
Yes.
Who did you give them to?
Mark Garrigus.
Alright, I'm going to refer to Exhibit 334 and 335, and I'd like to approach the witness if I may, Your Honor.
You may.
And I would, there is some post-its on there. I don't know if they're okay. May I inquire of counsel, Your Honor? Did you put the post-its on there, Mr. Auchincloss?
One of them, yes.
Okay. Alright, well, just ignore the post-its, alright?
Okay.
And take a look at Exhibit 334 and 335. Just take your time and look through it. So that's the pages from where your hand is all the way to the end of the book, basically. Okay. You don't have to look at all the pages.
Okay.
Somebody's already made an identification, but I'm just going to ask you if those, in general, appear to be the gate logs that you located in the office after the search?
Yes.
And those are the gate logs that you gave to Mr. Garrigus, is that correct?
Yes.
At the time you gave them to Mr. Garrigus, you understood that Mr. Garrigus was representing Mr. Jackson.
Yes.
Correct? And those gate logs are logs that were kept on a contemporaneous basis? In other words, things were written in them when they happened.
Yes.
Okay, now, before we go to some of the details in there, let me ask you a couple more general questions. Do the gate logs sometimes indicate instructions that are to be communicated to all of the security staff?
Yes.
And what's the purpose of that?
So that we follow that directive for the day. Or if it's a directive that's given to us for a 2-week period, then it's noted in the gate log and then carried over until it's no longer in effect.
Alright, may I approach and retrieve the book?
Yes.
Thank you. Alright, let me go back to a subject that you had discussed earlier with regard to records that were kept. There are medical records, is that right?
Yes.
And the medical records, are they part of the gate logs, or are they just?
No, they're separate.
So it's a separate file folder that you keep these.
A separate binder.
Or a binder? Alright, you mentioned that there was if somebody was disciplined, for instance, or let me withdraw that. If somebody was involved in a golf cart accident, as an example, there would probably be a record of that made, is that right?
Yes.
And I'm going to put, if I may, Your Honor, 300 up on the board. Or on the screen.
All right.
Now, the trick is to look at the board, and when you're ready to answer, turn around and speak into the microphone.
Yes.
So, first of all, just for the record, I'm showing Exhibit 300, and it shows the tab at the bottom there. And this particular document, the testimony was it was seized by the officers. Do you know where that was seized from?
It was most likely in a binder that was located at the security office near the house.
Okay, now, I'll ask you another question in a minute, so we'll leave that up there, with the court's permission. Was it the position of the staff, including the security staff, to reprimand guests, whether adults or children?
Yes.
Okay, and when would that occur?
Whenever we felt their safety was in jeopardy.
Alright, if it's not a safety issue, or an issue of legality, for that matter, something that involves security, was it your position to criticize guests?
No.
Okay, what was the policy at Neverland as far as how you treated guests, whether adults or children?
We were very accommodating. Our emphasis is on hospitality and making sure that they feel welcome.
Okay, and why was that?
That's what Mr. Jackson wanted.
And as far as, even though there are a lot of people involved, were you trying to make the atmosphere welcome to the guests, as if it was somebody's home?
That was our primary duty, was to make them feel welcome.
Okay, now, if somebody was driving the golf cart and there was a safety issue, you now have this up on the board, and it appears that the driver in this case was Gavin Arvizo, is that correct, on Exhibit 300?
Yes.
Okay, and this is something that happened June 21st of 02, is that correct?
Yes.
Alright, now, according to this, by the way, it says the reporting officer is G. Silva. That's not you?
No.
As, you were the chief at this time, though, is that correct?
Yes.
And you were responsible ultimately for all of the reports and acts by your officers, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, it indicates here, gave verbal warning to slow down or golf cart would be taken away. Would that be a policy?
Yes.
And so what would you expect your officer to do at a time like that?
To take the cart away, if it was necessary.
So if it went on, actually take the cart away and say, you can't drive the cart.
Yes.
And did that happen from time to time with guests?
Yes.
Alright, now I'll take this one down. And give me just a second, please, Your Honor, because otherwise the book is going to be a mess. Alright, the book is going to be a mess anyway. I have to deal with it in a second. Okay, now, were guests cleared to do? We can have the lights, if that's alright. I'll come back to this in just a minute. Were guests cleared to do certain things?
Yes.
Were some guests not cleared to do certain things?
Yes.
And there was a list which, because the book is falling apart, I'm not going to turn to it right now, but there is a list when people are coming on the property that, at various times during the time you were there, guests would be cleared for certain activities and not others, is that right?
Yes.
And one of the activities was using the quadrunners, was that right?
Yes.
If a guest was not behaving properly on the quadrunners or didn't show they were able to handle them, they might be excluded from using the quadrunners the next time?
Yes.
That would show up in your records so that you would be able to refer to that, is that right?
If we were asked for a particular event, we would be able to.
Now, did you always make things available to guests? Take your time. Have some water.
Excuse me.
That's okay. You also make equipment available to guests?
Yes.
If they ask for it?
Well, if they were allowed to use it, yes.
Okay. Were there occasions where you would not allow guests to use certain equipment?
Yes.
And what technique would you use to advise guests that, or convince guests that they might not use certain equipment?
Well, if they requested it and they were allowed to use it, of course we would make it available to them. If they requested it and they were not allowed to use it, then we would be very diplomatic about our reason for not allowing it to be used at that time.
And how might you do that?
We just would say simply that the quads were not available for this weekend or for this day.
Something like that. Alright, so once again, you're trying to be courteous to the guests, right?
Yes.
We'll come back to the gate logs in a little bit, but let me ask you some general questions. I'm going to take you back to the period from 1991 to 1993 when you worked there.
Okay.
Did you have occasion to know the Robson family?
Yes.
And can you describe the Robson family?
The family that I knew as a mother, daughter and son. Wonderful family. They seem to be very close-knit. Both Chantal and Wade are bright, very articulate young people. And they're always very pleasant to be around.
Did you ever see anything inappropriate occur with regard to the Robson family?
No.
Object. Vague.
Overruled. The answer is no. Next question.
Did you know the Culkin family?
Yes.
Can you describe that family?
Mother and father. I don't quite remember how many kids they had. I think they had a few. Nice family.
Okay, how about the Barnes family?
Yes.
Tell us about them.
I met the mother, Carly and Brett as well. I met the father once or twice. Wonderful family as well.
And did these families spend time at the ranch while you were there?
Yes.
Did they spend time as a family?
Yes.
Did they engage in activities at the ranch?
Yes.
Was Mr. Jackson always there when these families were there?
Not always.
Did you see Mr. Jackson interact with the families?
Yes.
If Mr. Jackson was on the property, did he spend all of his time with these families when they visited?
No.
What would Mr. Jackson do during this period of time besides spend time entertaining the guests?
I wouldn't know. I guess whatever Mr. Jackson does on his own time.
Okay, does Mr. Jackson have a studio on the ranch?
He has a dance studio.
Does he spend time in the dance studio?
Yes.
Is that someplace where he goes to work?
Yes.
Does he spend sometimes hours in the dance studio?
Yes.
Does he work in the dance studio till late at night sometimes?
Yes.
Alright, now, by the way, do you know the Chandler family?
Yes.
Can you tell me about the Chandler family?
Mother, young daughter at the time. I believe her name is Lily, and Jordy.
Okay, and same questions I asked with regard to the other families. Did you see Mr. Jackson spend time with that family?
Yes.
And sometimes he'd be on the property and wouldn't be with the family?
Yes.
And sometimes he would not be on the property?
Yes.
Now, for the most part, when children visited Neverland Ranch, did they visit the ranch with their parents?
Most of the time, yes.
Now, we've heard about the large groups of kids that would come from either hospitals, or Make-A-Wish, or disadvantaged circumstances. That's a different situation, I take it, is that right?
Yes.
And can you describe what would happen when those people would come to the ranch? I say, those people. When those groups would be invited to the ranch.
A typical day for them is they would arrive approximately between 10:30 a.m. and 11 o'clock. They would be greeted by Neverland staff. Depending on the size of the group, they'd either be divided into two groups or kept in one group. What they would see on the property is the zoo area, which they would arrive via small train that we have. They'd spend time there. They would have lunch approximately around noon, and either go to the theater or the amusement park. If we had two groups, one group would go to the arcade and do the same thing, but switch off so they weren't in the same places at the same time. Eventually both groups would end up at the amusement park at the same time.
Did those groups of kids tend to have a good time there, as far as you could tell?
Oh, yes.
Okay, is it part of the job that you enjoyed watching these kids?
Absolutely.
Now, those groups of kids would be monitored or, what's the word? Chaperoned or supervised by people that generally came along with the group. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then staff people at Neverland would also assist?
Yes.
With regard to the other children that came to the ranch, did the other children who came to the ranch generally come with their parents?
Yes.
In other words, the guests, the ones that might stay overnight, came with their parents generally?
Yes.
Okay, if parents were there to supervise, would it be appropriate for staff to override a parent's decision on something?
Yes.
And would that be appropriate?
That would be appropriate, again, if their immediate safety was in jeopardy.
So if kids were getting out of control, would you intercede?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last.
If kids were getting out of control, would you intercede?
Yes.
Did you have any knowledge of any child drinking alcohol or appearing to be under the influence at any time when you worked there from 1991 to the present?
No personal knowledge, no.
And the alcohol on the ranch where was that kept?
I believe there is some alcohol located in the kitchen. Generally it's kept in the wine cellar.
Alright, and was the wine cellar generally locked?
Yes.
Were children allowed to go into the wine cellar?
No.
Where was the key kept for the wine cellar? And I'm going to ask you if it's moved from one time to another. Would you tell us about that?
Depending on the activity, there are 2 keys available. One in the main house and one in the security office.
Alright, and do you know where the key in the main house was kept?
Mostly behind the door as you enter the house staff's break room.
So in the house, if you go through the back door, there is a little hallway that takes you to the left. That would take you to the kitchen and the family room, dining room, that sort of thing. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if you went through all of that, you'd keep going. You'd get to the library and to Mr. Jackson's private area. Is that correct?
Yes.
If you come in the back door and enter that hallway, just to the right is where the maid's break room is. Is that correct?
If you go through the back door, it's directly across. You go straight into the...
So instead of going left down the hallway, you just go straight into that room?
Straight into it.
Alright, and is that a room that has couches and chairs and whatnot?
Yes.
Comfortable room?
Yes.
And that's used for the staff to take breaks, I take it?
Yes.
And as you go across that hallway, just right inside the back door, the rack with the keys on it is just behind the door as you enter the break room. Is that right?
Yes.
And the break room is left unlocked for the most part. Is that right?
As far as I know it is.
Okay, now, with regard to children visiting the ranch and activities, and let's talk about the guests who were staying overnight as opposed to the guests from the Make-A-Wish and that sort of thing. Were both boys and girls included in the activities at Neverland?
Yes.
Was there any discrimination, to your knowledge?
No.
Did girls seem to have a good time?
Yes.
Do you remember Marie Nicole?
Yes.
And who's Marie Nicole?
Marie Nicole is the only daughter in the Cassio family.
Okay, and did she have the same run of the ranch, as it were, as her brothers?
Yes.
And you mentioned the families, the Robson family, the Barnes family. They both had daughters?
Yes.
And the Culkin family also had daughters, is that correct?
One daughter.
Were those girls entitled to the same privileges that their brothers were?
Yes.
Did they engage in super soaker games from time to time?
Yes.
Water balloon fights?
Yes.
Did they go in the jacuzzi?
Yes.
The pool?
Yes.
Play in the arcade?
Yes.
Go in the house?
Yes.
Alright, now, at some point, you met a person named Gavin Arvizo, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you recall roughly when the first time was that Gavin Arvizo came to the ranch?
August of 2002.
August of 2002?
August of 2000, excuse me.
Okay, that's fine. And did he come there with his family?
The first time I met him with his brother Star and his father David, I believe.
Okay, did you ever? Let me withdraw that. Was Janet Arvizo there the first time you met Gavin?
I did not meet Mrs. Arvizo the first time.
What do you recall about the first visit that the Arvizos had to the ranch?
Well, Gavin was quite sick at the time. What I most remember is the dad being present and taking care of him with his brother.
Okay, were there other visits between 2000 and 2003? In other words, before February of 2003, were there other visits that the Arvizo family made to the ranch?
Yes.
And during those visits, was Mr. Jackson always present at the ranch?
No.
Who did they tend to come with when Mr. Jackson was not present?
Chris Tucker.
Was the father always present?
No. After they came, I believe, after Gavin was sick, he seemed to recover, and I don't remember the father coming after that.
Okay, so while Gavin was sick, his father was there, is that correct?
Yes.
And while the father was there, how did the boys behave?
They were very well behaved.
When the father stopped coming, how did the boys behave?
They increasingly became a little more rambunctious.
Alright, now, you said that Gavin seemed to be ill and was eventually recovering, and he got to a point where he seemed to have recovered.
Yes.
Okay, while he was visibly ill, how did Mr. Jackson interact with him?
I think he was very gentle with him, very caring, just what I remember at the time.
Did he seem to be concerned about him, his well-being?
Yes.
I'm going to object. Calls for speculation.
It's leading. Sustained.
Alright, now, let's talk about up to the point just before February 2003. Do you recall the last time that this family or any members of this family visited the ranch?
I believe it was in the summer of 2002.
And how were the Arvizo boys behaving during that time, in the summer of 2002?
They were quite active during that time period.
And when you say, quite active, what did they do?
I would say they were enjoying all the privileges of the ranch. I wouldn't say they were non-stop, but they were pretty active.
Okay, and did they have some problems that seemed to need some attention?
Yes.
Can you describe what that was?
Well, we just had a viewing of a golf cart accident, so that would be one example.
Okay, do you recall the family coming to the ranch in February of 2003?
Yes.
And what happened in February 2003? Let me withdraw that. Let's start with this. What were the Arvizo children doing in February of 2003?
They were there for an extended amount of time. I don't know exactly what they were there for.
Okay, did they tend to be in the presence of the security people?
Yes.
Describe that.
Well, they were there for quite a while, off and on, throughout the weeks. We had contact with them because of their behavior, their activity. It was pretty limited to that.
What kind of behavior are you talking about?
You know, again, they were active. I guess I'm trying to be polite here. They were very active.
Well, you have to be. It's nice that you're being polite, but we have to ask you to just tell it like it is, whatever it is.
They were pretty reckless at the time. They were driving very fast in the golf carts. They were also driving ranch vehicles. They'd get in a ranch vehicle, and take off and drive, and we'd have to stop them. You know, they were young. They couldn't drive a regular vehicle.
Well, let me stop you at that for a moment. When you say, ranch vehicles, what kind of vehicles did you have to stop them in?
A regular van, like an Astro van. Mr. Jackson's personal vehicle, a Navigator at the time. Other things, they were pretty destructive, I would say.
So let's talk about the vehicles first. At the ranch, are the keys usually left in the vehicles during the day?
Yes.
Are they left in the vehicles during the night?
Yes.
In fact, in the garage. There are some vehicles that are parked in the garage, correct?
Yes.
And the keys for those vehicles are sitting right up on the dashboard right there in view?
Depending on what is in the garage at the time, I would say yes.
Okay, so when the Arvizo kids got the Astro van, an Astro is like a regular minivan, right?
Yes.
When they got in, the Astro van and started driving it, to your knowledge, did they ask anybody for permission?
No.
And where would they drive it?
They would drive it on the property.
Okay, do you know if they ever drove out through the gates, the golden gates I guess you call them?
Well, they did drive it around. How far they went, they never drove off the property, but they drove on the property.
Okay, did they drive golf carts through the golden gates?
Yes.
So they would be out in that area between I still don't have the word for it, but whatever it is, the private
occupied area of the property.
There you go, occupied area. They'd be out in the area that is more or less ranch land, is that correct?
Right.
Alright, were they neat and tidy?
Not always.
What would you tell us about that?
I'm going to object, unless there's some foundation as to personal knowledge as to this.
Sustained.
To your knowledge, did you see whether or not they were neat and tidy?
Same objection.
Sustained. To your knowledge, still encompasses beyond her personal knowledge.
Did you see, is what I asked. Okay, let me withdraw the first part. Did you see any behavior with regard to whether or not they were neat and tidy?
Yes.
Okay, what did you see?
I saw them wearing the same clothes for a few days.
How about taking care of policing their area or picking up after themselves? Did they do that?
Well, they littered quite a bit. So, the personal area I didn't have access to.
Alright, now, from February to March of 2003, did you see Janet Arvizo from time to time?
No.
Did you ever see her?
Rarely.
Okay, so let's talk about the rare times when you saw her, okay? Can you describe her demeanor during the rare times you saw her from February through March?
I would say she was from either excited or not excited. She was never just, I don't want to say, normal, but she was either very happy or she wasn't speaking.
Alright, was that unusual to you?
I don't know. I didn't know Mrs. Arvizo, so I don't know what her regular demeanor was.
I guess what I'm saying, are you describing somebody that we'd all, never mind. Let's put it this way. Are you describing what you might call normal behavior, or did this seem to be more extreme?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Alright, so she'd either be happy or she would be very quiet.
Very quiet.
I'm going to object. Asked and answered.
It's leading into the next question.
Well, that doesn't make it.
The answer was, very quiet. Next question.
Where would she go when she was on the ranch during that period of time, February and March?
Object. Lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Did you see where she went?
I saw that I know she was assigned a guest unit.
And did you see her at, now, you would not be in the house, is that right?
No.
Did you see her around other parts of the property from time to time?
Very rarely.
Who was taking care of the boys, Gavin and Star?
Object. Calls for a conclusion. Lack of foundation.
Okay, let me withdraw it, just to make this clear. I'm going to ask you about what you observed yourself, okay? So the first question is, based on your observations, who was taking care of the boys?
I still object. There's been no foundation that she ever saw anything, and it calls for a conclusion.
Sustained.
Did you see the boys, Star and Gavin, during this period of time, February to March of 2003?
Yes.
Did you see Devellin?
Yes.
Did you have an opportunity to determine who was taking care of the boys?
I would say Devellin was taking care of them.
Did you see Janet Arvizo interact with her boys at all during that period of time?
No.
What would Devellin do to take care of the boys?
If they needed correcting or if they were saying something that was inappropriate, she would ask them to stop talking about that, or she'd remind them to go take a shower, or something like that.
And what was Devellin doing on the ranch during this period of time?
She was doing what the boys were doing. Watching movies. Driving around in golf carts.
Did she seem to be having a good time?
Yes.
Did any of the Arvizo kids spend time, to your knowledge, to your observation, with the security staff?
Yes.
What did they do?
They would come and visit us from time to time in the office and sit in our office.
And would they talk to you?
Yes.
What would they talk about?
Oh, just regular things. You know, what we were doing, and, you know, what was going on, that type of thing.
Did they ever complain to you about anything?
No.
Now, you said you saw Janet Arvizo from time to time. Did she ever complain to you about anything?
No.
During the February to March 2003 period, did the Arvizos leave the ranch from time to time?
Yes.
Who took them off the ranch?
I would say it was limited to either Vinnie Amen or Chris Carter. Occasionally Joe Marcus, would take them off property.
Okay, and what were the purposes of going off the property?
I'm not sure. I didn't inquire. Once they were there at the gate and they were ready to leave, we would just open the gate and let them leave.
Were there times they went off the property, for instance, during the day, and they came back 3 or 4 hours later?
Yes.
And when they went through the gate, did they check in and out just like any other guests?
Most of the time. I mean, sometimes if we have a guest that's, you know, coming on and off the property, we wave them through. Make sure we get a head count to see who's leaving so we can account for them later.
So when people would go off for a trip to town, for instance, you would not necessarily always write that down. Is that correct?
No, we would write it down. I mean, someone will slip through. You don't always see someone. Maybe they're sitting down in the seat. And we try not to hold anyone up at the gate if they're leaving.
Alright, do you know Ronald Konitzer and Dieter Weisner?
Yes.
And were they at the ranch in February and March of 2003?
Yes.
Were they there every single day?
No.
Was Ronald Konitzer there with anybody?
He was there with his wife and his son.
And did you have an opportunity to observe Mr. Konitzer and his wife and his son?
Yes.
Can you describe their demeanor?
Object as irrelevant, Your Honor.
Overruled.
They seemed to interact like a regular family.
Were they impolite, or polite, or?
No, they were very polite.
When you saw Dieter Weisner there, what did you see him doing?
He was there on the property. Exactly what his function was, I don't know.
Alright, did you see either Ronald Konitzer or Dieter Weisner ever treat any of the Arvizos in an unusual or inappropriate fashion?
No.
Object. Lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Did you ever see any of the Arvizos in the presence of Mr. Konitzer and Mr. Weisner?
I can't recall a specific time, but they were there on the property at the same time.
They were there together with.
Move to strike as non-responsive.
All strike the last phrase. They were on the property.
Okay, well, during February and March 2003, were Konitzer and Weisner on the property at the same time as the Arvizos?
Yes.
Did you see any interaction between them?
No.
By the way, who is Miko Brando?
Miko Brando is the son of Marlon Brando.
And was he a guest or an employee, to your knowledge?
He's been both. But on this occasion, again, I don't know what he was doing. I know that he was there off and on.
Did you ever see Janet Arvizo leave the premises with Katie Bernard?
Yes.
Who is Katie Bernard?
Katie Bernard was the secretary at the time.
Alright, so she's an employee of the ranch, correct?
Yes.
And what kind of a vehicle did they leave in? Do you know?
I don't recall right at this moment. It probably was a ranch vehicle.
Alright, and do you recall roughly when this occurred?
It was during the time they were there. I believe during the initial part of their visit.
Okay, initial part of February? I couldn't hear you.
The initial part of their visit, yes.
Would that be the first part of February?
Yes.
And do you recall Katie Bernard? Let me withdraw that. Do you recall the purpose of Janet Arvizo leaving with Katie Bernard?
I believe she had a salon visit.
Okay, was there any film crew following them as they left the ranch?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
Not that, I was not told that.
Alright, you didn't see any film crew there to follow them when they left the ranch?
No.
Alright, was there anything that would have prevented any guest at the ranch, including Janet Arvizo, from calling 911 if they had some sort of emergency?
No.
And how do you call 911 from the ranch?
From the guest units, you immediately receive an outside line, so you could pick up the phone and dial 911.
So the guest units, you don't even have to use the code?
No, I haven't done it for a long time, but from what I believe, you can just pick up the phone and you get an outside line.
On some of the other phones, you have to dial a code to get an outside line?
Correct.
And that would be true for any kind of a call, is that correct?
Correct. We have an emergency procedure, something that would be similar in a hotel room. That shows you how to get out if there's an emergency. It's near the phone. It gives you directions on what to do in the event of an emergency. It would be either to call the extension at the gate and report whatever the problem was. Again, I'm not very clear if you can just pick up the phone. I'm almost certain you can. That you can pick up the phone and dial out and get an outside line.
So let's put it this way. The phones in the guest units may or may not require a code to get an outside line.
Correct.
But if you can make a phone call from the guest units one way or the other to Los Angeles, for instance, you can call 911, correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the form of the question in the sense that she says she doesn't know whether there's a code to get out or not.
Sustained.
Alright, if there's no code, you would just dial 911, and you get emergency dispatch, right?
Yes.
Object. Calls for speculation. She doesn't know.
Overruled.
And if the phones in the guest room had the same code as other phones on the ranch, you would dial the outside code and then 911. Is that right?
Yes.
Alright, and my question is, whichever way it worked, if you could make calls to Los Angeles, for instance, from the phone in the guest ranch, you would also be able to call 911, correct?
Yes.
So if somebody knows the code to call an ordinary number, that's the same code you'd use to get an outside line if you needed it, right?
Yes.
Was there an occasion when Janet Arvizo was supposed to leave the ranch and did not want to go or did not show up?
I recall a time that the kids left before her, and she left maybe an hour and a half after them. I don't recall the date, but I remember, leaving, it seemed a little inefficient to me, since they were all leaving, that she wasn't ready or, I don't know the reason for her delay, but she didn't leave the same time they did.
What kind of vehicle was there waiting for her?
I don't recall the vehicle exactly.
Alright, some sort of vehicle that was being chauffeured by someone?
It could have been a ranch vehicle.
But it was being driven by somebody?
Yes.
Okay, so somebody had the vehicle there and the kids were ready, but Janet wasn't?
Right.
Alright, let me ask you about the kids, that is, the Arvizo children, being allowed to leave the ranch. Were they allowed to leave the ranch anytime they wanted to?
They were allowed to leave the ranch, but they were supervised.
Alright, was there a concern about them not being supervised?
Well, their mother wasn't there on some occasions, so I would say yes.
Alright, and when their mother wasn't there, were they allowed to leave the ranch if they didn't have an adult with them?
Yes.
Okay, let me ask that again. Maybe you meant to say that. But if they didn't have an adult?
If they didn't have an adult, they were not allowed to leave.
If there was not an adult?
They needed to be supervised.
Do you recall if that was communicated to the security staff at any time?
Yes.
And how was it communicated?
It was directed to me verbally, and it was also a written directive.
And who told you that?
I came in on my shift, and I believe one of my supervisors advised me of the directive, and that's how I was notified.
Did the children? You talked to the children from time to time, right?
Yes.
Did they ever say they wanted to leave?
Object. Calls for hearsay.
Overruled.
I actually didn't finish the question, but let's just leave it at that. Did the Arvizo children ever say in your presence that they wanted to leave the ranch?
No.
To your knowledge, were they ever prevented from leaving the ranch when they requested it?
No.
Now, Your Honor, what I'd like to do is put up Exhibit 334. And this is the one that has multiple pages, so I'm going to refer to MJ00154 as the particular page from Exhibit 334. May I publish that?
Yes.
Thank you. Alright, that's not focusing really well. Can you read it?
I'm
going to.
The 19th of February?
Yes, February 19th. And I'm going to refer to this line right here. Can you read that line? If you can't, I'll bring it up to you so you can read it.
Yes, I can read it.
What does that line say, first of all?
The kids are not allowed to leave per Joe. Kids, meaning like Gavin, Star, etc.
Who wrote that there? Do you know?
I believe that was Officer Ellens.
So that was an officer who was doing that at whose direction? Do you know?
Per Joe Marcus.
And there's a number, 1752. So that would be 5:52 in the afternoon?
Yes.
Do you know if the kids, in fact, left the ranch that same night?
I'm not sure what time they left.
Alright, if you look at the gate logs, you could figure that out. We won't have you do it. They've already been introduced.
Yes.
So you could tell from the gate logs presumably when they left?
Yes. I'm sorry.
Alright, we can turn the lights back on. Is that your post-it?
Yes.
That's yours? And the contacts that you had with Janet Arvizo, did she ever indicate to you that she wanted to leave?
No.
And if she indicated she wanted to leave, would she have been allowed to leave?
Yes.
Were you aware as to whether or not transportation was arranged for, you mentioned one time. Other than that one time, Was transportation arranged for her to leave the ranch from time to time?
Yes.
All right. May I have just one moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Okay. While the Arvizos were there at the ranch from February to March 2003, did you see them have contact with other guests?
Yes.
And in particular, Devellin. Did Devellin have contact with other guests?
Yes.
Who do you recall, if anyone in particular?
Marie Nicole. Whatever other guests were there as well. We had quite a few guests during that time period. I can't recall exactly who was there, but whoever was there, she was involved with them.
Did she spend a lot of time with Marie Nicole?
I believe so. They were two girls, and so they did spend some time together.
And did Devellin also spend time with one of the firefighters, firemen, or whatever you call them there? I'm sorry.
Object. Lack of foundation.
To your knowledge.
Just a moment.
Let me withdraw it. I'll say some other words and make it better.
Okay.
You said you saw the kids spending time in the security office from time to time?
Yes.
Was there anybody in particular, either security or fire person, who you saw Devellin spend time with?
During that time period, or?
February to March of 2003.
Not anyone particular. I mean, she was there, but I can't remember anyone specifically.
Alright, so she spent time with more than one person?
Well, we're a staff, and we're active just as well. So I'm sure in passing, there was a greeting. Hello, how are you? That type of thing, or she would come in and ask for something, so.
Alright, now, what about the boys? Who would they spend time with, Star and Gavin?
They would mostly spend time with each other or alone, so, I believe Mr. Brando's son was there during that time period. So one of the younger Cassio boys was there as well.
Did they spend time with the Cassio boys, or one of the boys?
Yes.
Did they spend time with one of the Brando kids? This must be a grandchild.
Yes.
A grandchild of Marlon Brando?
Shane.
Shane. Did they spend time together?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I have no further questions.
Cross-examine?
Good morning.
Good morning.
During the time that you were at the ranch, you had a progression of responsibilities that got larger and larger, correct?
Yes.
So you worked there continuously from 91?
Yes.
Until current? You're a current employee?
Yes.
And you worked your way up to head of security at one point in time, correct?
Yes.
And now you've been. I don't want to use the wrong term, but you are no longer head of security?
No.
And there's somebody else who's head of security out there, correct?
Yes.
Now, during this period of time, you met a lot of families that visited the ranch, I would assume, correct?
Yes.
And you've mentioned the Robson family.
Yes.
As one of the families. The Culkin family?
Yes.
The Barnes family?
Yes.
And the Chandler family?
Yes.
The Cassio family?
Yes.
Okay. And the Arvizo family are just a few of the ones that visited the ranch, correct?
Yes.
With respect to the Robson family, I'm sorry. After the first visit of that family to the ranch, the father was never there anymore, was he?
I never met the father.
And with regard to the Barnes family, after the Barnes family visited for the very first time, the father was never there at the ranch when they visited, was he?
The father returned and made visits.
How many occasions do you recall Mr. Barnes being on the property?
From one visit to another? Do you mean separate incidents?
Yes, ma'am.
Or days? I would say at least 2 or 3 times afterwards.
Now, there were times that Brett Barnes, the young child, that he was at the ranch alone, correct, without any of his parents?
There could have been a time, yes.
There could have been more than one time, couldn't there?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Do you recall there was more than one occasion when Brett Barnes was on the ranch without any parents being present?
Yes.
In fact, he would stay several days at a time on the ranch, correct?
I don't remember the exact number of days, but I do remember him being there.
And when he stayed at the ranch, he stayed in Mr. Jackson's bedroom, correct, when his mother was not at the ranch.
I don't know exactly where he stayed, but he would stay in the main house.
So to your knowledge, he was in the main house, but you don't know where in the main house?
Correct.
And when Mr. Robson, not Mr., the child Robson visited the ranch, he was there on occasion without his mother or his father, correct?
I don't remember exactly that, but there could have been.
When he did, he stayed in the main residence also, correct?
Yes.
I'm going to object to the question of, when he did, as assuming facts not in evidence.
Well.
Are vague.
Overruled. The answer was, yes.
And you say, with regard to both Brett Barnes and to Wade Robson, that you just know they're in the house, because the staff was not allowed into the house, correct? The security staff, except if there was an emergency or at Mr. Jackson's request.
Yes.
And you recall the Chandler family, correct?
Yes.
Did you ever recall meeting Mr. Chandler?
No.
Or a Mr. Chandler at all?
No.
Or a husband at all?
No.
And the child's name was Jordan Chandler, correct?
Yes.
You know who I'm talking about when I talk about Jordan Chandler.
Yes.
And Jordan Chandler visited the ranch on a number of occasions without his mother, correct?
Again, my recollection is he may have. I'm not sure.
And when he did, he stayed in the main house.
Yes.
And again, you don't know where he stayed in the main house.
No.
And Macaulay Culkin visited the ranch without his parents, correct?
I remember him mostly being with his parents, unless he was an adult. He's been there recently without his parents.
Well, I don't mean, you're right. I should go back. Between the period of 1991 and 1993, Macaulay Culkin visited the ranch without his parents being present, is that correct, on occasion?
My recollection is that he was there with his parents.
Is it your recollection also that he stayed in the house?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned one of the families that you saw a good deal of is the Cassio family, correct?
Yes.
And one of the people who you observed over the years was Frank Cassio, correct?
Yes.
And you know him as Cassio, right?
Yes.
And when you first met Mr. Cassio, he was just a young boy, wasn't he?
Yes.
In other words, he was about 11 or 12 years old.
I'm not sure of his age.
Would he be about the same age as the other boys who were visiting around that time? Brett Barnes, Wade, Jordan?
Most likely, yes.
And he also would spend time with Mr. Jackson in Mr. Jackson's house, correct?
Yes.
And the difference is that in this case Frank Cassio used to visit with Mr. Jackson a lot, correct? Kept an ongoing relationship with Mr. Jackson?
The family kept an ongoing relationship.
Okay, that's fair enough. So it was the whole family, as well as Frank Cassio, that kept a relationship with the defendant?
Yes.
And you would describe, would you not, that this family is very close to Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
Based on your observations?
Yes.
And you would, I believe you said that in the year 2000, you knew that Mr. Frank Cassio went to work for Mr. Jackson, correct?
I have not said that here.
No. I'm asking. You said that to an investigator, correct?
Yes, possibly.
Objection. Calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Did you not tell somebody that you believed he went to work for Mr. Jackson in the year 2000?
Yes.
Objection. Excuse me. Calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Move to strike.
Stricken.
Where did you get the knowledge that Mr. Cassio went to work for Mr. Jackson in the year 2000?
Objection. Calls for facts not in evidence. The court sustained its.
Sustained.
Thank you.
Were you at any time aware of the fact that Mr. Cassio worked for Mr. Jackson?
I was aware that he was working on projects on the property for Mr. Jackson.
During the time frame from 2000 to 2003, would that be the time period that you had reference to?
Yes.
And would you describe the relationship between Mr. Jackson and Frank Cassio during this period of time from 2000 to 2003, That it continued to be a very close relationship, correct?
Yes.
A trusted friend, correct?
I believe so.
Now, with regard to Mr. Frank Cassio, were you aware of the fact that he changed his name or was using another name?
Yes.
And that was during the time period of February and March of 2003, correct?
I believe so.
And he used the name Frank Tyson, correct?
Yes.
Was that the first time you ever heard him use the last name of Tyson during that period, February and March?
I don't know if it was during that time period, but I could safely say probably yes.
It was during the time when the Arvizo family was at the ranch, correct?
I believe it was during that time period.
And in fact, during 2002, Mr. Tyson had visited the ranch on a number of occasions, correct?
In 2002?
Yes, ma'am.
How many times I don't know, but most likely he did.
When he visited, he would have been noted in the logs, the ranch logs that you referenced.
Yes.
And on each occasion he's referenced as Cassio, is he not?
Yes.
Did you ever see Mr. Jackson having meetings with Frank Cassio during February and March of 2003?
I'm sure they met. I don't know if it was an actual meeting or what it consisted of, but they spoke with each other.
They had a lot of conversations between the two of them, did they not, regularly? Or conversed regularly, how about that?
Well, they're friends, so I imagine they would have a lot to talk about.
And Dieter Weisner, did you see him having conversations with the defendant during February of 2003?
No.
Never?
Never.
You never saw them in Mr. Jackson's office meeting?
I did not see that.
But if they were meeting in the house, you wouldn't have known that either, would you?
No.
With regard to Mr. Konitzer, did you ever see Mr. Jackson meeting with Mr. Konitzer?
No.
Now, you mentioned Miko Brando. And he has a son named Shane, correct?
Yes.
And it's correct, is it not, that actually during February of 2003, Shane Brando got in an accident with one of the carts and actually injured Gavin, did he not?
Yes. They both crashed into each other.
But the log reflects the fact that it was Shane Brando who was at fault, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Now, how old is Shane Brando in 2003? About the same age as Gavin?
I'm not sure how old Shane is. He's a big kid, so I don't know his exact age. Actually, he's probably about 16 now, so.
So he would have been about 14 or 13 then?
Sure.
You've talked a lot about the procedures for the security on the ranch. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, you've said that there is a procedure now where people work 12/12, 2 shifts, right?
Yes.
That wasn't always the case, was it?
No.
Back in 1991, 92, 93, there was a graveyard shift, correct?
Yes.
And that shift started at 10 o'clock at night and worked through the morning hours, correct?
During different times, when I initially started working, the shift started at midnight till 8 o'clock in the morning. I don't know what year we changed that where the shift would start at 10 p.m. and work till 6 a.m.
But there was a shift that worked from 10 o'clock?
Yes.
Called the graveyard shift, correct?
Yes.
Now, just a couple of questions about the logs that you've described. I think you said earlier in your direct examination with Mr. Sanger that the gate logs, went to the administrative office up on the hill, correct?
Yes.
And how did they find their way down to the security office?
The gate logs are used to verify the payroll. Payroll is done on Monday mornings. So if someone forgets to punch in or punch out, then they refer back to the gate logs to see what time that employee left, if it was needed. Once they're through with them, then they're filed back into the office and they're kept in that file for a year, until the end of the year, when they're filed in another box and stored.
By the office, do you mean taken physically from the administrative office down to the security office?
Yes.
Would you tell me how many drawers are there in the cabinet that you say you retrieved these logs from?
There's 4.
And which of the drawers was it that you retrieved them from?
They were in the second drawer.
Second from the top or the bottom?
Second to the top. Second to the top.
Now, the keys to the house. you say they're kept in the break room, correct?
Objection. That misstates the evidence, the keys to the house.
Overruled. You may answer.
The keys to the house?
Well, keys to the arcade. I'm sorry if I said the wrong building. I'll take that back. The wine cellar. The keys to the wine cellar are kept in the break room?
Yes, they are kept in the break room. Yes, they are kept in the break room.
The break room has a safe, correct?
Yes.
At any time during the time you worked there, have those keys ever been locked in that safe?
Yes.
And during the time that you've worked there, has it been the habit and custom of the people working on the property that the housekeepers, during the daytime, keep the key on their person during the entire day?
Yes.
In fact, you had to go retrieve the key from the housekeeper the day of the search warrant to let the officers in, correct?
Some of the keys I did not have access to during that time period, so it was not available to me. I would have to ask them for the key.
So the answer is
Yes.
on the day of the search warrant, you had to go to one of the housekeepers to get the key to allow the officers to get in the arcade and the wine cellar, correct?
For immediacy purposes, yes.
Now, in 2003, I'm assuming that if you were the head of security at that time, if you had any problems, staffing problems, they would have been things that you discussed with Mr. Marcus, correct?
Yes.
And do you recall having a conversation with Mr. Marcus where you discussed the fact that you were very short of staff and it was becoming a security issue on the ranch?
Yes.
Objection. Calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Move to strike.
All I asked was if she had a conversation. I didn't ask what was said, Your Honor.
You kind of filled that in, though.
Did you have a conversation with Mr. Marcus about security issues of concern to you?
Yes.
Now, let me ask a few other questions about procedures at the ranch. For instance, the groundskeepers, their day staff only?
Yes.
So what time would they ordinarily leave?
Their working hours are from 7 a.m. to 3:30 p.m.
And the maintenance people, same hours, basically?
Yes.
So they would go home at 3:30?
Yes.
And the zoo people?
Same time.
And most of the maid staff would go home at the same time, except those that were kept for the night?
Yes.
And those that were kept for the night would come in at a little later time, correct?
Yes, I believe so.
So basically, other than a few staff, well, let me ask you this. The housekeeping staff that was retained at night was smaller in numbers than those that were there during the day, correct?
Well, it would depend on the activity. I couldn't say during that time frame. I wasn't in charge of that department, so I'm sure. Just as I would schedule people for the bulk of the activities, so if they had something going on in the evening, I'm sure they would schedule for more in the evening than they would during the day.
Fair enough. But that would be the exception, not the rule, though, correct?
No, that's what we had to work with, so you schedule your people when you need them.
No. I meant, it would be the exception that they would have to be there because you were having an event as opposed to the normal situation. You don't have events every night?
No, we don't have events every night. But if we have large groups of guests on property, such as during that time period, then, dinner may be served late. I'm not sure exactly what all their duties are, but
that would be an exception where you would have those kind of events. Obviously you'd have to have people there to help, correct?
yes.
Now, you say that the security staff is not allowed in the building. I'm sorry, in the main residence unless called by the defendant, Mr. Jackson, or there's an emergency, correct?
If it's not necessary for you to be in the house.
Move to strike as non-responsive, Your Honor.
Stricken.
I think you told us that the only two occasions where security staff, were allowed into the house was either because Mr. Jackson summoned one of you or there was an emergency. Now, is that correct?
Yes.
You have on occasion been in Mr. Jackson's bedroom, correct?
Yes.
And you know that to get into Mr. Jackson's bedroom, as you approach the door, there's a chime that goes of inside of the room, correct?
Yes.
And you also know that the door is locked from the inside, correct?
I believe there may be a deadbolt there.
And that a person you cannot enter that room without somebody unlocking the door from the inside, correct?
If there's an emergency, I would get through that door.
I'm sure you would. I'm not trying to say you wouldn't do your job and break through it. But short of breaking through the door, you would have to have somebody on the inside open it up, correct? Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And certainly if that was true of you, it would certainly be true of any guest that was staying at the place, correct?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
At the time that these young boys that you've talked about were in the main residence with Mr. Jackson, they were there without, on many occasions without parental supervision, correct?
I would say there were some occasions. I don't know if there were many occasions.
I'll settle for some. There were some occasions where some of these young boys were in the house with Mr. Jackson with nobody else present. Is that a fair statement?
I would say that would be fair.
It would also be a fair statement that inside of his room, that nobody would be allowed to go in there and see what was going on. Isn't that a fair statement?
Objection. Your Honor. Calls for speculation. No foundation.
Sustained.
I would say that would be normal for anyone.
Wait. The question was sustained, the objection.
So the simple answer would be, you had no idea what was going on inside the house when those boys were there with Mr. Jackson?
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained.
Do you want to take the break, Your Honor?
All right, we'll take our break.